Hey guys, it's Libby, and today I'm doing my, what month is it? March wrap-up. I only read 3 novels this month, and one of those I DNF'd, so maybe this will be a short video, but maybe I'll find a way to go on for 20 minutes like I do with all my other wrap-ups. So the book that I DNF'd was Little Big by John Crowley. I've taken the bookmark out, so I don't remember precisely, but I think I got about 70 pages in. I'm not able to tell you that much about the premise, partially because I didn't read that much of it, and partially because, it's very nebulous. This book is very hard to pin down and, actually talk about. So, based on the little that I read and the back description, it's about 4 generations of a family in upstate New York, and they are kind of, magical, maybe, and you get the impression that if you walk through the woods behind their house for long enough, you will end up somewhere else. This novel is incredibly literary, and it sort of felt like I was trudging through the prose, and I trudged for so long because I felt like this was all going to sort of pay off and mean something, but the further I trudged, the more I was like, I think it's just all gonna be like this, and I'm not gonna hit anything satisfying. So I've given up, but if you have read this book and it does blow your mind eventually, let me know and I'll try it again. I initially picked this up because I read another book by John Crowley called The Translator, and it's the same guy, so he's writing in kind of the same style, but I think it worked in that book because he was talking about concrete events. But in this book, he's not really talking about concrete events. He's talking about more sort of whimsical fantasy stuff. And so there's sort of no concrete anywhere. It's like Jupiter. You're just falling through atmosphere permanently. Whereas with the Translator, you fall through atmosphere like on Earth, but there is, a planet underneath. I'm so good at metaphors. Fortunately, the next book I picked up was one that I had already read and knew that I loved very well. It is The Meaning of Night by Michael Cox. This book, I think it is actually impossible to determine how many times I have read this book. I had a physical copy. I've gone through sort of many physical copies. It's been that sort of book for me where I get one and then I lend it to somebody and they never give it back. So I buy a new one and then I lose it, so I steal my mom's copy, but then I find my old one. I've had at least 2 paperbacks and now this hardcover. And I also got the audiobook, which is very good. And I listened to the audiobook after it had my wisdom teeth taken out. Anyone who's been there knows that you spend the next 3 or 4 days in a drugged up haze as you try to ignore the pain of the holes in your face. So I had the audiobook of The Meaning of Night and its sequel, The Glass of Time, just on repeat through that whole process. So I would sort of drift off and then wake up and say, oh, what are our characters doing now? That's nice, back to bed. But I haven't read it in a while, and I think that's the thing a lot of booktubers say about their reading experience. Before they joined booktube, they kind of read the same 20 books just over and over again, and then when you join booktube, you hear about all these other new books and you try a bunch of new things, and you kind of leave behind old friends, so it was nice to hang out with it again. So this is a lot of ramble about not the actual book, and that's because I'm a little bit afraid to talk about this book because since I know it so well, and it is a mystery, there are things that are revealed throughout the narrative. There's not just one big reveal at the end. I'm really afraid that I will spoil something because I can't quite remember when you learn everything because I just already know everything from the beginning. So I will try, but I apologize if this is not as precise summary as you would like. This book is set mainly in the 1850s, but we do go back to 1819 and sort of work our way forward from there at a certain point. It jumps around in time. And our main character is a man named Edward. His last name is also complicated. It does say Gliver on the back, so Edward Gliver. When we first meet him, he has murdered an innocent stranger in the back alleys of London, and he goes and has a nice dinner afterwards. And then he takes us back and recounts basically his life story and how he got to this state where he's murdering someone he doesn't know. And this book is so crazy good, you guys. It's narrated in the first person, and the narrator is very unreliable. And Edward is just like the most interesting dude. I would listen to him talk about his breakfast, and he does talk about his breakfast on several occasions, and I love it. Now, in terms of the plot, I don't think that this book is perfect, even though it is a mystery. If I'm remembering correctly, going back to the very first time I read it, I was typically able to guess each reveal maybe 50 pages in advance. Like, you can't figure out the whole story just from the beginning, but you figure things out before Edward reveals them to you. But I just don't care, because I just want to hang out with Edward and the other characters in this book. I was afraid that I would have grown out of it since reading it like 4 or 5 years ago, but I'm glad to say that I have not. It is just as good, and I highly recommend it. I gave it 5 stars. And then staying in the mid-19th century but moving across the Atlantic, I finished Mrs. Poe by Lynn Cullen. I have already made a video about this book. It wasn't so much a review, it was a discussion of all of the things that this book does wrong in the context of a historical fiction novel. But it also had some problems just as a novel. This novel is not actually about Mrs. Poe. Or is it? It's about Frances Osgood, who was a writer of children's fiction and short stories. I can't remember if she ever actually successfully wrote a short story. She certainly tries. And poetry. And she was living in New York in the 1840s at the same time as Edgar Allan Poe. And she and Poe published some love poems in his journal that modern Poe scholars think are, and also people at the time, thought were directed at each other, but they were both married at the time. So Edgar Allan Poe, as you may know, was married to his first cousin. He married her when she was 13 years old and he was 26. Some people think that this was a white marriage, and this text remains agnostic on whether or not Edgar and Virginia ever consummated their marriage. This book explores Frances's relationship with both of the Poes, her fraught romantic affair with Mr. Poe, and her complicated friendship with Mrs. Poe. And there were 2 things that I thought were interesting. The first one being the sort of impression of the publishing world that you get at the time. In the first scene, Frances is having a discussion with the man who publishes her poetry and short stories, or at least he had in the past, and he's trying to get her to write something sort of creepy and dreadful like Edgar Allan Poe. And you see Frances sort of struggle to create art that is marketable. And then I also quite enjoyed what we got to see of Frances's relationship with Mrs. Poe. I thought it was a very interesting dynamic that I haven't really seen before. The whole, I need to behave in this way so that this woman doesn't think I'm romantically interested in her husband, because I'm not. Wait, am I? However, I didn't really feel that this book delivered. Primarily, I did not buy the romance, partially because it wasn't very well written. I have no idea what Frances sees in Edgar Allan Poe, and partially because, as I mentioned in my discussion of how not to write historical fiction, the notion of like hearing about the romantic lives of actual historical figures I find kind of blah. And secondly, because I felt like for much of the book we were sort of cycling through the same scenes and it got boring. You know, we'd have a scene where Frances goes to a sort of soiree with the various figures of New York literary and artistic society, and then we'd have a scene where she has some intimate interaction with one or both of the Poes, and then we'd have a scene of Frances struggling to write. And the first 2/3 of the book was basically just that over and over and over again. Right towards the end, I got like a glimpse of maybe what this book was trying to be, and that was to be a Poe-esque short story with like that sort of horror and suspense. And I was like, why wasn't it all like that? So Mrs. Poe, rather a disappointment, 2 stars. So that's all for March. Thank you for watching, guys, and hopefully I'll find more things that I like in April.